Okay, so I got my seams trimmed. I clipped them and I trimmed them, and then I got my pins out, and I tried to pull the fabric out all the way around and pin it so that when I top stitch it, I can get as even a circle around the outside as possible. So work with your fabric, because it is fleece. It's not going to be as easy as other fabric that's going to lay flat, because you've got the thickness of the fleece, and also you've got the just the characteristics of the fleece that is going to make it a little more difficult to work with. But just try to get your circle as round as possible. That's basically all you're trying to do, is make your circle as round as possible. So now I'm just going to top stitch all the way around the outside. I'm going 1/4 of an inch, and basically all I'm trying to do is keep my seams together and keep my hat flat. So I'm going to go all the way around the outside. I'm going to try and speed this up a little bit. Okay, so as you're working and you see that one spot's not pulled out, just take a needle or a pin and pull it as you're top stitching it, and that will give you more of that rounded look. So once you reach your first stitch, just do a couple back stitches and overlap it so it looks uniform. Okay, take your scissors and cut your threads. Okay, so next step is going to be to put a seam on the inner circles. And all that is we're just going to try and put a seam in so that we can, let me take these pins out, so we can get that 17-inch strip sewn on. And we want the fleece not only to stay together, but by sewing that, sewing an inner circle here, we're also giving it like stay stitching, so the fleece won't stretch as much. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So same thing, if you want to, you can take pins and pin it together. If it's a little off like this, don't worry about it, but don't cut that down, because you don't want to make the inner hole any bigger than it is. If it gets bigger, it's not going to fit on the doll's head. So you just want to put a couple pins in here to hold that inner seam together. So lay it flat, pin it, just to tack it down in a couple places so you can keep the fleece together. So now we're going to put a seam in the middle circle. I want to make my seam 1/4 inch, so I'm going to just take my needle position, and I'm going to go over just a couple clicks from the center, maybe 1 or 2 clicks, so your seam will be between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch, because it's only a stay stitch to keep your seam together. So I'm not worried about my needle. I'm still lining up with my edge of my pressure foot, but my needle is over to the right, so I know I'm not going to be on my stitching line. Another thing you can do too is also use a larger stitch on this sleeve. You don't really need I'm using a tight stitch, but you really don't need to use that small of a stitch. I just always forget to change my stitch length, so that's why I just keep it the way it is. Here. Okay, so we've got the middle circle sewn. I think I'm running out of bobbin thread. I couldn't find any dark purple thread, so I'm running out of thread. I probably won't have enough to finish this. We'll see. Okay, so once we've got our inner circle sewn, and we have our circles together, we're going to take our scissors and we're going to clip in a tiny fraction, a tiny bit of that that line of stitching. We're going to just clip just a fraction of an inch, not even 1/8 of an inch, just clip on the other side of that seam. And the reason we have to do this is because we're going to have to be able to sew that inner piece of felt to this inner circle. And the only way to get this to go on a straight line is to make little clips in here, so that when we sew it, it will sew flat. You know, this is just my technique. You know, you can probably come up with something better, but you may not even have to use that cut, but that's how I did it. Okay, so now I'm going to take my 17 inches and I'm going to give myself about 1.5 inches, and I'm going to put this anywhere on my inner circle, and I'm just going to put a pin there. I'm not even going to pin this. I'm going to sew on here with this underneath, and I'm going to line this up flat as I sew this inner circle, this strip to the inner circle. So let me show you. I'm going to start here and I'm going to start working. So as I'm doing that, I'm not even going to pin it, and that's why I'm not going to put a seam in there until I get all the way around the circle. And the reason for that is I don't know how much this inner circle is going to stretch as I'm sewing these two pieces together. So let's go ahead and put my needle back to the center position. Give yourself a couple back stitches. Oh, I think I'm going to have to change colors of thread, or something is wrong here. Yeah, I might be running out of bobbin thread. I don't have any of this dark purple left. I should have gone with a different color, but I didn't. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple back stitches, and I'm going to sew. Okay, so as soon as I get to a curve, I'm going to turn this, and I'm going to pull all my fabric to the back over here and get this inner circle into a straight line, and then I'm going to line it up with my seam, and I'm going to sew that. But I'm going to try not to stretch my inner circle, because if you stretch that inner circle, even with the stay stitching, it's going to be way too big for your doll and it's not going to fit. So just go ahead and keep sewing around the circle, but do not stretch that inner circle. So here I'm going to turn this again. I'm going to pull my extra fabric around the back. I'm going to line those 2 stitches up, and I'm going to sew. We're going to do the same thing with the vinyl hat. So this one's the easy one to practice on, because once we get to the vinyl, it's going to be a lot harder to sew on the vinyl than it is to sew on fleece as a walk in the park to sew on, compared to the vinyl cowboy hats. So let's go ahead and just keep going. Okay, turn it again, and same thing. Line up your, don't stretch it, line up your stitches flat straight, and sew that. Okay, again, line up those stitches, get your fabric underneath out of the way, and sew. Okay, same thing, turn your fabric, do not stretch your stitches, sew. Okay, turn, sew. Get my fingers out of the way here. Okay, I don't even know if I have any bobbin thread left. I think I'm still sewing. Okay, so turn, move your fabric out of the way, your brim out of the way, get your fabric lined up, and sew. Okay, when you get within about 1 inch of your previous stitch, just backspace and pull it off. Okay, so let's go ahead and take that out. Try and be frugal with my thread. Okay, so we've got, at this point, we have got almost the whole brim, I'm going to have to come back and fix that. I didn't sew it deep enough. See how I did that? You can see my previous stitching and my cut. So I'm going to have to go back and put another seam in here and catch that up. But before I do that, I'm going to turn my hat inside out. Well, yeah, outside in, I'm sorry. So I'm going to take my 2 pieces, see how I gave you that 17 inches to work with? And I'm going to line up those 2 pieces of fabric, and I'm going to put a pin in there, because that's where I'm going to want to make my seam, because I didn't use that much. So if you want to do it this way, that's fine. Go to your first seam, but it's easier if you just go somewhere in the middle so you have some space to work with. I hope you can see this. So I'm taking this and I'm pushing them together, and I'm going to put a pin there. and that's where my seam is going to be, going up on the brim. So if you don't like this technique, you can probably ease in once you figure out how much this you need, you can ease in your fabric and make it a set amount. But I've done these fleece hats 1, 2, 3 times, and every time I've used more or less of this 17 inches. This time I've used a lot less of that 17 than I did before. I only had maybe this much left over. But you understand that the more you use of this 17 inches, the less likely it is going to be to fit good on your doll. Okay, so once I have that, I'm only going to line these two up, and I'm not going to go all the way to the top. I'm just going to sew them about a couple inches, because I want to decide how much of this, what kind of angle I want this to go once I get that turned over and I can look and see what I want. So I'm going to sew that for 1 inch. So I'm going to take where my pin mark was. If you have like and line up my fabric here. If you have like a piece of chalk or something that you can pick your sewing line, to mark your sewing line, or a piece of something, just something that will tell you where to sew, that would be good. Okay, so that's that. Okay, so now I'm going to sew that seam, but I'm not going to go all the way to the top. I mean, you can go all the way to the top. There's no reason, you know, but you probably want to wait and see what kind of angle you want to put on the top, because your angle will depend on what your cowboy hat's going to look like. So let me just go ahead and put a quick couple inch seam in there. So I just went up a little bit. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to not cut the whole thing. I'm just going to cut like it's a normal seam allowance, and then I'm just going to leave the rest of this up to decide where my angle's going to go. So now I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to finish off that seam around the, I'm going to line this up, and I'm going to put the rest of that seam in here. And I'm going to pick up that one spot that I messed up. Oh, it's getting late. I'm going to have to stop it, I think, and come back and finish this later. Let me get this last seam in so you can see what I'm doing here. Okay, so I'm going to pick up that last bit of seam. So I'm going to turn that around, and I'm going to go back and sew over that one place where I can see the seam on the outside. Okay, I'm going to turn this again so I don't catch it. Okay, so I've got that. We're at the top hat stage right now, and we haven't got this figured out yet. So I've left myself room where I can go in and decide if I want to angle this in a little bit more, so I can start from here and angle it in, or if I want it to be wider for like a top hat. this would be the same thing. Well, you know what I'm thinking of is the Mad Hatter's hat. You know how the Mad Hatter's hat is narrower around the rim than it is at the top? So it's at this point where you can determine whether you want that to flare out or if you want to turn around and sew it more narrow to go in further this way. That's going to determine what your hat's going to look like. But because we're going to do a cowboy hat, we're going to sew straight across. We want a narrow top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to angle this in. I'm going to angle it in towards the top so I can make my top narrower so I can get that nice inward slant. I want my hat to slant in, not out. So I'm going to go in with that seam. So at this point I'm just going to line up my seams, and I'm going to go from here and I'm going to slant myself in. So we can, at this point, we can cut a lot of this bulk off because we know we don't need that. But when you, if you don't give yourself that 17 inches and you're not pushing the fabric in and you're stretching it, you probably won't have any residue left to cut off. That's why it's important to push that inner seam in. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put this seam in, and then I'm going to have to stop right here and come back later and finish this video. But that's where we're at, okay? So we've just done the brim, and now we're going to sew our inner seam together, and then we're going to sew this together, and then we're going to make a couple tucks right here, and that's going to be the whole cowboy hat, and it's pretty much done. And then it's going to be your choice as far as how you want to finish your inner seam. On this one, I just I'll explain this one when I come back. But on the white one, what I did was I just took some bias tape, bias tape, and I covered all of those stitches up, and I didn't even line the vinyl one, and you don't really need to line the vinyl, and you don't even need to line the fleece. I did on this one, and I did a really bad job lining this one, but you can just take a narrow piece of fleece and cut it, and then top stitch it around here like this, and that can finish off your cowboy hat too. But anyway, when I come back, we'll finish up this purple cowboy hat and see what that looks like. Okay, I'll be back. So talk to you later.